Okay, here we're going to talk about the town establishment of Rutherfordton, early Rutherfordton. Here we have where it talks about the courthouse being the center of the community and community activity. Aside from legal business, most courthouses are used for, it was also used for public speakings, teachers, institutes, and sometimes for exercise at the close of the school term. It was also the gathering point for Memorial Day parades, is where the Memorial Day parade started. And the courthouse bell was rung in cases of disasters such as fires and even murders, and to celebrate events of state and national importance. It was rung upon receiving the news of the battles of Manila Bay and Santiago, and even when the state voted for prohibition are just a few examples. And also here it talks about the Beckler neighborhood. Christopher Beckler, the guy who minted coins that was seen earlier. He established his house on North Washington Street at 6th Street in 1838. They joined a neighborhood of imposing homes. So basically just talks about the early neighborhoods of Rutherfordton. Next here we see different quotes from Washburn, who was mentioned in the previous slide. He has a quote by him, Dr. Benjamin E. Washburn, who grew up here. He was an author and a physician. He was an author and physician, and who grew up in Rutherfordton. And here he talks about, there are quotes by him that talks about how the early development of the town looked, how the town, like for example, how the stores were all of wood, except for in one case there was one building made of brick that soon caught fire caught fire and was burned after the Spanish-American War. And it also talks about how his father's store was directly across from Hardin's store, which he thought that location was the best in town, and it's on the popular side. And it was also during this time period he mentions how women, there were certain times of the day where they would only be seen on the streets. They wouldn't seen on the streets at certain hours throughout most of the day, because women obviously didn't have many rights back then. They were, basically just seen to be working at home. And right here he also talks about the conditions of the streets. For example, how the early sidewalks were just kind of like boards. They were a little bit raised boards. And also how the streets weren't paved for a while. And during rainy days there was stepping stones for where people could try to avoid the mud. Here we have to talk about hotels in the county, early hotels. First you have the Isothermal Hotel, where prominent inventor, we had two prominent visitors, where Thomas Edison, inventor, and author Carl Sandburg enjoyed their stays and amenities of the hotel. It had over 78 years of operation. The hotel occupied 3 different buildings on different locations on Main Street. It was a social center of the county at the time, other than the courthouse, which in earlier times. So it shows as the county grew, the difference in the town grew. There are different social centers, and here it was the Hodge Hotel, which really was torn down in the late 20s for the construction of Ara Central High School. And here it is a picture of the Cottage Hotel on North Main Street, across from St. John's Church. And the Southern Hotel on Main Street was in operation since 1910, and however it became to where the balcony was torn down, and around the early 30s the drugstore, or the hardware store, the Hills Hardware Store, which is still in operation today. Here we have the backbone, or the backbone and the driving force of the economy for most of many years throughout the South, the textile industry. And here we have the Tanner companies. And the textile industry entered Rutherford County in April of 1885 when Raleigh Rutherford Haynes and Simpson Tanner Sr. collaborated to construct a textile mill around the Second Broad River. When the plant was completed 2 years later, in October of 1887, it was the largest textile plant in the entire state. Haynes and Tanner would eventually part ways, or part company, and follow different business paths. Tanner made his home here in Rutherford County, or in Rutherfordton, for many years, and it was the driving force in the creation of the neighboring town of Spindale, which is just a couple of miles down the road. And S.B. Tanner Sr. was aided in his ascent to prominence by finding favor with a Charlotte banker by marrying his daughter, and that really helped him thrive to expand his textile empire. And in 1907, Tanner was elected the president of the American Cotton Manufacturers Association, which gave him national exposure and solidified his reputation. And here you see Mr. Textile Manager S.B. Tanner right here, and surrounded by his 3 young sons. And over here, if you want to pause the video at any time and read this, you can. It talks more about the Tanner industry and his prominence in Rutherfordton. Here we have architecture of Rutherfordton. It is scattered throughout the town and historic districts surrounding neighborhoods. There are buildings, there are architectural styles from before the Civil War throughout the 1930s. Many of the public buildings that you will see in Rutherfordton are still around. They were built in those times from the 20s and 30s. Here you have the Rutherfordton Firehouse, which is now a hotel, and also, or more like a bed and breakfast style hotel. And then you have the town hall, or one of the town halls, and here you have a school that was up until the 1990s that served as R.S. Central Rutherfordton Spindale Central High School, now as R.S. Middle School. It is also on the National Register of Historic Places. And this brings us to the end of our history, because most of these buildings, that they are still around. You see them, and you can visit them and still see how Rutherfordton developed throughout the years. And you can still see their presence, the historic presence, the presence of history through these buildings, and they still serve a purpose. So, and it goes to show that how long they've been here. So I hope this gives you a little bit of history, brief history about the developing or the modernization of the town, kind of how it is today. There are a lot more modern amenities today, but when you visit, you see the towns right on Main Street. You can see kind of how the town was get a good idea how the town was set up back in the day. And like I said, you can still visit Hills Hardware Store, which is still on Main Street. Has been there since the 1930s, and is still in operation. You can still pretty much get a feel of the old general store style ways, mainly with the main focus on hardware. But you can still see, my point is, you can still see all of the different how the town developed. But through the architecture, it is still remaining.